The news broke just this morning that Disney plans to open its next theme park and resort in Abu Dhabi. So, if nothing else, I am guessing we will see fewer fat bearded transvestites working in the Bibbidi Bobbidi boutique, since, the leaders of the United Arab Emirates tend to handle such behavior with the swift application of the death penalty. And there will probably also be a conspicuous lack of rainbow themed Mickey apparel, I'm guessing, at Abu Dhabi Disney. Now, this isn't a story I would normally make a point to mention, but it happened to arrive at a rather fortuitous time because just in the past couple of days, I've been kicking a theory around in my head, and it's a theory that centers around this question. Does Disney have an unspoken Muslim dress code for its female stars? And I think there's enough supporting evidence that one can reasonably conclude, yeah, they probably do. I think they might. So it's an interesting time for the news to arrive that Disney plans to build its next theme park in one of the world's most conservative Arab Muslim countries, and it does dovetail fairly nicely, I think, with that theory that I have had rattling around my cerebral cortex. Is it within the realm of possibility that covering up all their female stars was designed to make the emirs in the UAE more receptive to the building of an Arab Disney World? Well, I think it very much is. Now, you may remember an interview that Elizabeth Olsen gave in, I want to say it was probably around 2020, because it was shortly after the release of Avengers Endgame. But much of the interview dealt with how offensive Elizabeth Olsen thought it was that in the first couple of films where she played the Scarlet Witch, her costume showed a bit of cleavage. Now, why was she so outraged about that? Well, I can't say. It seems like there are worse things in the world than a woman displaying a bit of décolletage, and it has to be said, Elizabeth Olsen has worn a variety of outfits on various award show red carpets that left way, way less to the imagination than the early version of that Scarlet Witch costume that she says bothered her so much. The point being, she went to the producers before they made Endgame and she put her foot down on this whole cleavage thing. So they accommodated her request and they gave her a 100% body covering outfit for both the final Avengers picture and the second Doctor Strange picture. But it seems in retrospect that this might have kicked off a trend. Because think about all the Disney films since then, not just Disney Marvel, but Disney Star Wars and regular Disney as well. The second Black Panther movie, the third Ant-Man movie, the third Guardians of the Galaxy movie, the Marvels. You can go right down the line. And do you remember so much as a female forearm or ankle being exposed in any of those films? Because I don't either. Or do you remember nothing but full body coverage with costumes that seem specifically designed to downplay any hint of female curvaceousness? And why on earth would you put Snow White in a long-sleeved dress? Isn't that kind of a jarring image when the character hasn't ever been depicted that way at any time in her nearly 90-year history? There are only two exceptions that come to mind, and if there are others that are escaping me at the moment, please do let me know down in the comments. You had the Little Mermaid remake from a couple years ago where I guess you can't really avoid depicting that character in a bikini top, but hey, at least they race swapped her and made her be black. And the other exception is when they very briefly showed Brie Larson in a sports bra during the fun musical team building montage in the Marvels, which we know they made during the reshoots when the test audiences had told them the original version of the picture made it seem like the lead characters all couldn't stand each other. So they shoehorned in that little clumsy montage of the three of them like playing jump rope and laughing it up like they were best buddies. And who knows, maybe Brie Larson in a sports bra, which they of course put in the trailer, was part of a desperate last-ditch effort to forestall an historic box office catastrophe that everyone could see coming from a couple light years away. And yes, if Brie Larson in a sports bra is your last best hope for saving your Marvel film, it is safe to say you have painted yourself into quite the regrettable corner. But since in the actual event nobody went and saw the movie anyway, I guess the Emiratis didn't notice, and thank Allah for that. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where if you see white smoke from the chimney, it means we have just elected a new head kitchen wench. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And yes, As you may have discerned from that little allusion, my prediction held true. The papal conclave was indeed very, very brief, ending on the second day and the fourth ballot, if I'm not mistaken, and culminating with, much to the surprise of many observers, the election of history's very first American Pope. Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost, 69 years old, out of Chicago, Illinois, is the brand new Bishop of Rome, the Vicar of Christ, the occupant of St. Peter's throne, and all the various other stuff that Catholics call the Pope. He has taken the papal name of Leo XIV, and all the Vatican watchers, as they often do, are trying to use his choice of regnal name as some sort of window into what kind of Pope he's going to be. And I won't pretend to be an expert on any of that, but I have done a bit of reading on the last Pope, Leo XIII, both previously and again this morning since this news broke, which I will get to in just a couple moments. As for the former Cardinal Prevost, and I'm not sure exactly how he pronounces his name, which isn't his name anymore anyway, but I still do apologize if I'm getting it wrong. He was on the big list, as it were, what they call the Papa Billy list, which in the literal sense translates to Popeable. So it's basically the big list of all the cardinals who are considered to be eligible and qualified for the post in terms of being in the right age group and having the right sort of stature and reputation within the church and so on, but I didn't hear his name on any of the short lists that I heard, and I heard a few different ones from commentators who follow this stuff for a living, and I can't recall that happening with either of the other papal elections that are within my living memory. Either in 2005, when the former Cardinal Josef Ratzinger was widely considered the frontrunner and did wind up being elected, or when the former Cardinal Bergoglio was elected in 2013, because he might not have been the clear frontrunner, but he was on pretty much everybody's shortlist, as it was widely expected that the College of Cardinals was in a mood to elect the first Latin American Pope, which they, of course, wound up doing. So the new Pope, the former Cardinal Prevost, he can probably be considered a dark horse winner in much the same way that Cardinal Wojtyła, whom we now know as Pope John Paul II, was in the conclave of October 1978. In that case, Cardinal Wojtyła, as he was then, was considered a guy who would potentially be a frontrunner at some time in the future, but most people thought he was still too young at age 58 to be seriously considered for election. But you have to then consider what the state of affairs was when that conclave was being held, because they had just held the previous conclave only 5 weeks earlier, in which Cardinal Luciani was elected, who then took the papal name John Paul I and promptly dropped dead 33 days later. So there was a real sense among the College of Cardinals that we probably need to go for maximum continuity here and install a pope who's likely to remain alive longer than 5 minutes. So Cardinal Wojtyła, who hadn't received a single vote to my knowledge in the previous month's conclave, all of a sudden his relative youth became an asset where before it had been seen as a disqualifying impediment, and he winds up being elected rather quickly in the actual event. Now with the new Pope, Leo XIV, I dig that name, by the way. Not sure why, I just dig it. It was his Americanity that was seen as his disqualifying impediment. In terms of age and experience and reputation, he was right in the zone, right in the sweet spot, but there was no expectation of an American Pope actually being elected, and especially not this year, because that would have made 2 popes in a row from the Americas, so that's probably what kept him off of everybody's short list. But it would seem the College of Cardinals decided that his qualifications outweighed the inconvenience of his nationality, so here we are. Now, in addition to hailing from Chicago, he does also have strong connections to Latin America, which I am sure worked in his favor. He was the Bishop of Chiclayo in Peru from 2015 to 2023. After he was elevated to cardinal, he became president of the Pontifical Commission for Latin America, a post that he held until just earlier this year. He speaks 5 languages fluently, as many popes do: English, Spanish, Italian, French, and Portuguese, in addition to being able to read German and Latin. And his Italian sounds pretty good, based on what I heard when he delivered his first blessing to the assembled throngs in St. Peter's Square this morning, or this evening if you happen to be in Italy. But you can definitely hear a Yankee accent in there, which makes the whole thing seem kind of incongruous for some reason. Like, it makes you think, wait, is that an American guy dressed up like the Pope? Or who knows, maybe that's just me. Now, On to the matter of guessing what kind of pope the new pope is going to be, based on which name he chose. The last pope, the late lamented former Cardinal Bergoglio, surprised a lot of observers by becoming Pope Francis the Only, a name that had never been used, but then he was a Jesuit. St. Francis of Assisi is the patron saint of the Jesuits, and there had never been a Jesuit pope before. So that one, while surprising to many, was still pretty self-explanatory. And when Cardinal Ratzinger took on the name Benedict XVI, it was seen as a sign, based on the papacies of the previous two Benedicts, that he was going to be very much a doctrinal conservative, which he already had been as a cardinal, and which he remained as pope, and then afterward as Pope Emeritus. When Cardinal Wojtyła called himself John Paul II, there was no mystery in that one either. In fact, he came right out and said it. He said, "I'm paying tribute to our dearly departed former pontiff and signaling my intent that my papacy will proceed largely along the same lines that his papacy would have if he was still with us." And to the extent that he wound up doing that or not doing it, that's a matter I will leave to the Catholic theologians. But I do know a little bit about Pope Leo XIII, who presumably is the guy the new pope has named himself after. The most notable thing about Leo XIII was the length of his reign, 25 years, 1878 to 1903, the fourth longest in history. And if you're a regular viewer, you will have heard me talk before about the historical period known as prisoner in the Vatican, which refers to the 60-year-long period between Italian independence in 1870 and the Lateran Treaty in 1929, during which time no reigning pope ever left the precincts of the Vatican. So when Cardinal Petri, as he was then, goes to the conclave in February 1878 and is duly elected Pope Leo XIII, his reward, as a practical matter, is that he gets to spend the remaining quarter century of his life in the Vatican, effectively on house arrest. So if out of the entire 60-year prisoner of the Vatican period, this guy was the Pope for 25 of them. He's prisoner number one, in other words, if you want to say it a different way. Now, why was it that no pope dared to physically leave the Vatican for a full 6 decades? Well, as you know, the pope used to be a temporal ruler in addition to being a spiritual leader. Going back many centuries, the papacy was an actual earthly kingdom that ruled over much of the Italian peninsula in varying degrees. By the time you get to the second half of the 19th century, the Papal States, as they were called, they had been reduced to kind of a band of territory across central Italy centered on the city of Rome, as you might expect. But at the end of the Italian Revolution and the proclamation of the new Kingdom of Italy, which comes in 1870, that all goes away. The Pope's armies are defeated, the Papal States are conquered, even Rome itself falls to the Italian forces, all except for that little patch of land that we now call Vatican City. And it was felt, probably not unreasonably, that the physical presence of the Pope inside the Vatican was the only thing preventing the Italian army from storming the gates and finishing the job of eradicating that last little tiny chunk of what used to be the Papal States. And this uneasy status quo persists all the way up until 7 years after the fascist takeover of Italy, when Mussolini calls up the Vatican and says, "Look, let's just work out a mutually agreeable treaty. We will ensure the territorial sovereignty of the Vatican, and the Pope can leave his house again. It'll be great." So yeah, in case you were not aware, the only reason there is a country called Vatican City today is because the church had to deal with the fascists, which is, to the best of my knowledge, the only act of any fascist regime that is still considered to be in full force today. Now, in terms of his political and doctrinal outlook, Pope Leo XIII is best known for his 1891 encyclical titled Rerum Novarum, which was considered in its day a fairly radical piece of work. In fact, there were some critics who thought it was pretty wildly heterodox, since it affirmed quite a few things that wound up animating the cause of world leftism in the first couple decades of the 20th century. And there was no false advertising here, because Rerum Novarum translates directly into English as revolutionary change. And it's really more of a treatise on economics than it is a discussion of doctrinal matters, and I guess it probably speaks to Pope Leo's sense of objectivity, that socialists thought it was a paean to capitalism, and capitalists thought it was a paean to socialism. And the Pope, he seems to have foreseen that such a controversy would probably ensue, and so he closed the encyclical by explicitly rejecting socialism and capitalism both, and I respect that. having always been of the mind myself that if both sides are hurling insults at you, you are probably doing something right. The subtitle of the encyclical is On the Conditions of Labor, and that's mostly what it concerns itself with, specifically the lives of the laboring classes in a Europe and a larger world that had rapidly urbanized and industrialized over the course of the last 3 or 4 decades. So the great issue of the time, which in many ways it still is, was how best to balance the rights of business and capital with the rights of the working class upon which business and capital rely for their continued existence. Now, up until the time of this encyclical, these discussions were mostly the province of political philosophers. This was really the first time that the head of an institution as large and powerful as the Catholic Church had come out and said things like, maybe people shouldn't have to work 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, or maybe all people should have property rights, and not just those who happen to have been born standing on a certain rung of the social ladder. In effect, the thing he was promoting, what we today would call upward mobility. That maybe permanently stratified social classes are not a part of God's grand plan. Maybe God intended that exceptionally talented and hardworking people should be able to ascend to whatever social station where their talent and hard work might carry them. And maybe the state and private industry can also gain a benefit by allowing that potential for upward mobility to exist. Again, these are concepts that aren't considered remotely controversial from our perspective here in the third decade of the 21st century, but in 1891 it was considered some pretty wild stuff, especially coming from the head of the most traditional, most conservative institution on the planet. And his overarching theme was effectively that if no accommodation is reached between these forces that exist in a permanent state of tension with one another, then there exists the danger that the history of the 20th century might be a story of class conflict in which neither side will come out the winner. And regrettably, that wound up being a fairly accurate prediction. Now, do I mean any of this to suggest that I have any idea what kind of Pope Leo XIV is going to be? No, I haven't got the slightest idea what kind of Pope he's going to be. But I expect there will be many observers, particularly on the right, who will go to Wikipedia, pull up the article on Leo XIII, see that he's famous for an encyclical titled Revolutionary Change, and instantly jump to the conclusion that the new pope is going to wind up being some sort of crazy leftist wokester type. But I wouldn't worry too much about that. I mean, even the most liberal popes, of which the late Pope Francis definitely was one, they are still pretty rigid and inflexible on the larger doctrinal questions. I mean, if I'm being honest, the biggest question surrounding Leo XIV is a liturgical one, namely, whether he is going to continue with the suppression of the traditional Latin Mass that was begun, of course, at the Second Vatican Council in 1962, and which was accelerated under Pope Francis. And it's a particularly pressing issue for the Church in America because the version of the liturgy that is being suppressed, the traditional Latin Mass, those are the only congregations in this country that are gaining large numbers of new members, particularly in the younger generation. And who knows? Instead of assuming that the new pope is going to automatically have an affinity with the forces of political leftism, maybe he means something altogether different when he aligns himself by his choice of name with the author of that encyclical Revolutionary Change. Maybe, just maybe, the revolutionary change being alluded to is a revisiting of some of the doctrinal and liturgical changes that were undertaken at Vatican Council II. Because there's fairly wide agreement at this point that some of those changes have not been good for the Church, of which the suppression of the traditional Latin Mass is only the most famous one. Again, not saying that I know how any of this is going to go, but I guarantee you it's going to be damned interesting having an American pope. Now, is it just blind coincidence that the first American pope gets elected within mere days of the U.S. president posting a picture of himself in papal vestments? Or alternatively, could it mean there really is a God, and he's got a pretty awesome sense of humor, and he's a Trump fan? We report, you decide. Thanks ever so much for watching. Have a great day and a pleasant tomorrow. See you next time. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.